think we are now live. Welcome to Measurement and Dimensions of Inequality on this last day of the conference. We have 4 papers in this one. We're going to have 10 minutes for each speaker. We're going to do 2 papers, discussant, 2 papers, discussant, and then take responses at the end and also questions. Please remember, if you're an audience member, depending on how you're watching this, you should have a box to ask questions either to the right of the video or below the video. So please do keep those coming in as we are doing papers so that we have something to talk about at the end. So first in this session, we have Peter Ganong, who is Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy. And he is going to present wealth, race, and consumption smoothing of typical income shocks. Take it away, Peter.
Great. Can everyone see my screen share okay? All right, I've lost video of all the other participants, but I'm assuming it's going well. So thanks so much for putting us on the program. This is joint work with several co-authors at the University of Chicago and the JP Morgan Chase Institute. 42% of Americans do not have money set aside that could be used for unexpected expenses or emergencies. And yet there's little empirical evidence on how monthly income fluctuations affect consumption. Particularly an area for concern is that 55% of Black households, these statistics, by the way, from the current population survey, report not having savings for unexpected shocks, which is well above the rate of 38% for white households. This racial wealth gap has changed little since 1870. Since then, the US has had a series of historical policies which have excluded Blacks from asset accumulation, which is part of why the wealth gap exists today. Similar wealth gaps exist for Hispanic households versus white households. The goal of our paper is to construct precise estimates of the consumption response to typical labor income shocks and investigate how this varies by wealth and by race. I'm going to have 3 slides about data, 4 slides about our identification strategy, 4 slides about results. So the first part of our data set is bank account data from Chase. We see data on income, in particular labor income if workers are paid by direct deposit, with a unique firm identifier that enables us to construct links between coworkers. We also in the paper look at unemployment insurance and consumption by race, but I'm not going to have time to cover that today. We define spending in the same way that Anna Maria Lusardi does in her 1996 JBES paper. And so we're going to try to focus on non-durable spending. We also observe checking account balances, which we're going to augment using data from the conservative consumer finances that has broader measures of assets. The second key data set we're going to use is data on race. So there are 7 states where to register to vote, you are asked your race, and most people respond. And so we're going to match the voter files in 3 states, Florida, Georgia, and Louisiana, to the Chase bank account data. It's going to give us a sample of 1.8 million households, including over 400,000 Black households and 400,000 Hispanic households. This is an orders of magnitude larger sample size than previously available data to study household financial questions by race. So you might wonder, well, if you take bank data and voter data, who do you get and who's in the sample, and to what extent is that representative? So this square here shows you the median Black-white household income ratio in the US. The triangle shows you the ratio for people who have bank accounts and live in these 3 states. And then the red dot shows you the ratio in our data. We can do the same exercise for checking account balances and the same exercise for liquid assets. So the inequality between Black and white households, as measured by statistic at the median, looks quite similar in the bank account data matched to the bank voter data as matched to the Chase data. The same is true if you look at Hispanic white wealth gaps. I'm going to talk about identification strategy next. So we're going to use an instrumental variables strategy where the instrument is going to be the leave out mean change in coworker pay. And so the conceptual idea here is we're going to ask, when your coworker's pay goes up, first, does your pay go up? Yes, it does. And then what happens to consumption? So on the x-axis here, I've plotted the change in the log of mean coworker pay. And then this is the change in the log of individual pay. So when your coworker's pay goes up, your pay goes up. When your coworker's pay goes down, it goes down. This shock is temporary. So if you look 1 more month forward in time, there's no change in spending. And so this is a temporary shock to income. this way of identifying changes in income and to study consumption is somewhat different from the prior literature. So there's two streams of the prior literature. One is what I would call a semi-structural literature by, among others, the Luigi, Pistafari, who's going to present next, which uses all of the income variation in the data. And then there's a literature that uses unusual windfalls, such as tax rebates or lottery winnings. The concern about unusual windfalls is mental accounting. So when the first stimulus checks went out in 2001, White House cabinet members spent their time on the Sunday shows calling for a mass national shopping spree. And these type of labels can have dramatic effects on spending. Our paper and our identification strategy is a hybrid that it tries to incorporate the best of both worlds from the two prior strains in the literature, because firm pay shocks are not only rare, they actually happen quite frequently, but they're hopefully, or we assume, exogenous with respect to the individual's consumption decision, except for their effect on income. In the paper, we talk more about exactly where do firm pay shocks come from, and it's primarily hours volatility, but I'm not going to have time to talk about it today. I'm going to get into results. So I have 4 results to show you. The first result is that there's a sharp pass-through from income to consumption. So it's an elasticity of 0.23. That means that when household income goes up by 10%, consumption is going up by 2% on a monthly basis. When it goes down by 10%, consumption is going down by about 2%. When income goes down by 10%, consumption goes down by 2%. Second, we look at heterogeneity by race. So this line shows you the slope for white households and the slope for Black households. The elasticity for Black households is 0.29. The elasticity for white households is 0.2. What that means is that Black households are about 50% more responsive in terms of their consumption to income shocks than white households are. We also look at Hispanic white households, and we find a similar gap in the sense that it's less consumption smoothing for Hispanic households, but the gap is smaller in magnitude between Hispanics and whites. Third, we look at heterogeneity by assets. So here I've plotted how does the marginal propensity to consume differ by a household's asset buffer. And I've done it 3 times in terciles, quartiles, and quintiles to make it easier to compare to the prior literature. So we always find a downward gradient. The low asset households are sensitive and the high asset households are relatively insensitive. This is useful because if you think about what our theories of consumption say that there's a tight negative correlation between liquid assets and the MPC, but prior empirical evidence is actually somewhat unclear. So I've shown here 3 prominent prior papers in the literature, and they're consistent with a strong downward slope, meaning low asset households are sensitive and high asset households are not. They're generally also pretty consistent with there being no slope at all between consumption smoothing and asset holdings, and in some cases even consistent with an upward slope. And so our estimates are much more precise, and the fact that we have these precise estimates enable us to show this sharp downward gradient, which economists have theorized about in the past but haven't had data on. Our 4th result is about heterogeneity by race controlling for assets. So this shows you the raw black-white gap. This is the gap controlling for just checking account assets. And this is the gap when we control for imputed liquid assets. So when you control for assets, the black-white consumption smoothing gap is gone. The Hispanic-white gap is actually reversed to some extent. How do we interpret this? When households have the same income shocks and financial buffers, households of all races react similarly. And this means that non-wealth channels that may differ by race, such as credit access, family structure, labor supply, are either quantitatively small or cancel each other out. However, I want to be clear, our results do not imply that race is irrelevant for consumption smoothing. Instead, what our findings suggest is that the disparities in consumption smoothing by race that we see are likely mediated through the racial wealth gap. And wealth gaps themselves are driven by current and historic factors that are functions of race. To conclude, in this paper, we developed 2 new tools. First, there's an administrative data set with income, consumption, assets, and race. Second, there's a method for identifying firm pay shocks. The paper makes 4 contributions. The first is an estimate of the pass-through of income to consumption. Our estimate is statistically precise, and it uses typical income variation, not the unusual windfall variation that's been used in much of the prior literature. This pass-through varies by race and wealth. Black and Hispanic households have higher elasticities. High asset households almost fully smooth firm pay shocks. And this finding is consistent with a previously hard to test benchmark prediction from quantitative models. After controlling for assets, racial differences are negligible, and that points to a role for the racial wealth gap in explaining differences in consumption smoothing. Finally, in the paper, we talk about a finding that the welfare cost of temporary income volatility is high, especially for people with low assets, such as Black and Hispanic households.
Great, thanks, Peter. Super interesting to see people using the JP Morgan Chase dataset for things and have more evidence on MPCs. All right, so we're going to go to Luigi Pistafari. This is a multi-country database of income dynamics and inequality. Luigi is professor of economics at Stanford University and Ralph Landau Senior Fellow at Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Take it away, Luigi.
Thank you. So this is this whole initiative is joint with Fatih Guven and Gianluca Violante. So unlike the other presentations in this session, we don't actually have like original research because we received a grant from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth to fund two initiatives. The first was a conference on global income dynamics, which was held at Stanford in the summer of 2019. And the papers that were written for this conference will appear in a special issue of Quantitative Economics. I'll detail a little bit what these papers are about. And the second thing that we did, or we are going to do with the grant, was to set up a website, which is in progress, which will allow users to access free of charge a variety of key statistics about the distribution of income levels and income changes for a number of countries for many years and many subpopulations of interest. And I'm going to spend most of my time on this particular thing. So why this project? So there are already several databases that collect information from many countries about cross-sectional information about income inequality. One example is the WID that was spearheaded by the effort of, among other people, Tony Atkinson, Piketty, and Saez, and others. Or also the World Income Inequality Database, which is at the UN University, and a number of OECD databases. And also, publishing a special issue of a journal detailing income inequality patterns across countries, not new. Gianluca and I actually were special editors of a special issue in 2010 of the RED. So what's new in this project is that we noticed that a lot of, mostly, but not all of these cross-country databases are based, not exclusively, but a lot are based on micro data coming from survey. They're mostly focused on cross-sectional aspects, and they tend to be aggregated at the population level. So you can have yearly statistics, but you don't have the sub-aggregation by, for example, education or year birth cohort or things like that. So our goal in this project, and eventually and ultimately the kind of data set that we will make available to outside researchers, is to expand to expand the focus of the existing databases to data that are administrative in nature, to include information on the panel or longitudinal aspect. So you will follow the micro units over time, or the statistics of the micro units over time, and also to allow to look at the dimension of heterogeneity, the dimensions of heterogeneity that exist in the data. So let me expand a little bit on these 3 points. So all the data that we are going to be that we'll make available to outside researchers is going to be coming from administrative archives, either tax records or social security data. And The reason why we think that this is important is that it's a well-known fact that survey data suffer a lot of big advantages, but also some disadvantages, like they tend to suffer from sample attrition and measurement error. They tend to be unrepresentative of the tails of the distribution, particularly the top tail of the distribution, and sometimes also the bottom, although this might be a problem that is common also to administrative data. And because of their small sizes, they tend to be affected by problems of statistical power. In contrast, administrative data have a number of advantages because you typically have access to the universe of sometimes the entire population. There is no attrition of any meaningful type of attrition. There is no problem with declining response raises. And if you, of course, think that misreporting is minimal, there is also minimal error in the data. The sheer size of the data, sometimes you have access to millions and millions of observations, allow granular analysis of behavior in subpopulation, and also high order moments, like you can study the evolution of top 0.01%, something that would have no meaning if you had access to just survey data. One important disadvantage of administrative data is that they tend to be very good in one particular domain. Like you have a lot of measurement-free data on income, but not much else. So you lack the richness and the variety that you have in survey data. Now, this can be partly, this problem can partly be remedied by the fact that now it's becoming widespread to link different sources of administrative data in different domains. So you can get income data from one source, expenditure data from credit card data. You can get information health if you work with Scandinavian data in particular, and so forth. So this can actually be very useful for researchers because it can provide tools for quick but actually quite relevant policy analysis or policy responses. And one recent example is the work of Rascheri and co-authors on the impact of COVID-19 and policies like the CARES Act to study expenditure patterns across different parts of the United States. And in terms of understanding why we think that an analysis of several countries may be useful, there is first of all the fact that now a lot of countries make administrative data available to researchers. So 20 years ago when I started working with administrative data, it was really a rarity to have access to this kind of information. Today it's kind of almost the norm. If you look at a typical paper that is published in a top 5 journal, tends to be more likely than not be a paper that uses some form of administrative data rather than survey data. And so the advantage of doing this at a multi-country level is that you can do what you typically do with comparative analysis. It's just you have more precision, more richness, and so forth. Longitudinal dimension is also important because if you use cross-sectional data, you have plenty of information about inequality, like you can get static snapshots of the distribution, but miss longitudinal dynamics that provide information is really important for wealth, for like volatility, changes in income from one year to the next. You need to observe people over time to have information about that, and volatility is important to understand what happens to risk and uncertainty. If you can follow people over time, you can also, or generations over time, you can also have some idea about whether the American dream is over or not. So this is related to the work of Raj, of course, and others. And even importantly, there's a lot of models in economics that care about the behavior of the tails. Like any model of careers, for example, we want to know what's the probability of big wage cuts or big wage hikes. And of course, you will need to follow people over time to get a sense of this. And finally, the heterogeneity. So many studies document that, for example, inequality, volatility patterns vary dramatically across individuals defined by characteristics like the year of birth cohort, the gender, the education, the work, the firm they're working for, the level of permanent income, and the location in which they live, in which they were born, and so forth. And the existing databases provide, don't provide information, these heterogeneity aspects, but they're mostly focused on aggregate statistics by year.
You have about 2 minutes, Luigi. I can let you run over a little bit, yeah.
Perfect. I think we'll be fine. But it's crucial to instead being able to separate ex ante heterogeneity from ex post uncertainty in the outcomes like the consumption, the wealth accumulation, and so forth, to understand how heterogeneity and risk evolves over the business cycle over the long run. And these are all kind of inputs in the design of policies that, for example, provide insurance against shocks and redistributive programs as well. So the long-term goals is to assemble these databases from multiple countries. We have at the moment 13 countries that are, participating, US, UK, etc. This is the list that we have at the moment. And we will basically have a call for having more countries contributing to the databases. We are already, receiving kind of requests for contributing from a number of other countries. The website will include thousands of statistics per country with annual updates. We are, besides the WCEQ, we have also fundraising for maintaining the website and for making it worthwhile for research. And if there is someone out there who wants to, help with the funding, you're welcome. Just email me or the other partners in crime. And we are already in talks with an institution for the design, the technical design of the website, which of course we don't have the expertise to work. And they have already developed a mock-up for us. Like, it will look something like that. You could download time series data for different countries, different years, for different measures of earnings or and statistics like the volatility, and for different types of groups like education groups. And an output could be something like that. This is the skewness of changes in income for different countries. You see, the business cycle fluctuations typical of these measures. You can do, a little bit even more micro, like doing differently for different education groups. So you learn about how different groups experience changes in income from one year to the next. You can also do, life cycle analysis, like you could actually select, and this is where the microeconomic heterogeneity aspect become important. You can select one country and cohorts, year birth cohorts within countries, and even do this analysis differently by gender. There is simply not a website that collects this type of micro level information that makes it available to researchers from at least an administrative point of view. So I'm pretty much done.
All right, thanks so much, Luigi. We are going to turn next to our discussant, David Johnson, who's the director of the panel study of income dynamics and a research professor at the University of Michigan. And last but not least, a member of Equitable Growth's Research Advisory Board. All right, go ahead, David.
Okay, thanks. These are two great, I'm going to call them projects because I know these, Peter and Luigi have been working on these types of things for a while and will continue. So most of my comments are going to focus on what I would like them to continue doing with the data sets they have. And these are two very unique data sets in terms of looking at administrative data and looking at commercial data. They've discussed a lot of the problems with those and the benefits, and I'm going to push them to do more of looking at the admin or commercial data in conjunction with survey data. Obviously, since I run the panel study of income dynamics, I'd like to see comparisons across all the data sets. So that's sort of what I'm going to go through when I talk about these. So why do I have this cartoon here? Well, I think one of the big issues on administrative data is constructing a household. And so if they're really good at individual data, they're really good at earnings. It's really hard sometimes to construct a household or a family and how people pool their income and resources. So I'm going to push them both to look at this a lot when they construct these data sets. In fact, I know the data set that Luigi has in their global database is the LAHD for the US, and that's sometimes very hard to create a household. Wait a second. There we go. So I'm going to start a little bit with the database. So like I said, I think we really like to know, I'd like to know more about how they're constructing families or households, looking at this administrative tax and earnings data and how that's going to translate in dynamics. Because earnings dynamics is really critical, but I think what we really need more of is we need more of total family income dynamics and how that affects the well-being of families. He mentioned some demographic characteristics, but on the little chart he showed it just male and female. I'm just wondering what other demographic characteristics there'll be. I think that's what was so great about Peter's paper, was a very clever way of getting race into the database by linkages. And I think that could be some of the stuff they're going to be linkages to. And then finally, what are the key estimates? So we mentioned volatility, inequality, in mobility. So it'd be good to know what those estimates are going to be, because I'm going to push them to then compare them to other data. So Luigi mentioned a couple of the sources, the WID database, but there's two he didn't mention, and I'd like to mention them. One is the Luxembourg income study, which is basically cross-sectional data, but a lot of the estimates that are going to come out of this are going to start with cross. Everybody's going to want to know what the inequality is over time. And then they're going to look at volatility. Well, they could then go and compare each of their countries to what the list data get for inequality measures or median measures or mean measures and all those simple cross-sectional measures over time. The other database is the cross-national equivalent file, which is a database of 9 household panel surveys across the country. And I think we really need to compare the administrative data to the survey data for these countries, because a lot of these countries and the things they're producing are very similar. And again, I think benchmarking the key estimates from the administrative data to some of the survey data estimates that are obtained in the Luxembourg income study. So then we can see what administrative data is going to provide us. Now, the biggest thing it does is it gives us sample size. And as you'll see when I go to the next, that's very important in determining the actual impacts of some of these things. So here's an example. This is done by Robert Moffat, where he used a number of data series comparing the earnings volatility of men by a number of different data sets. And you can see since about the 1990s, the trends are very similar, right? Whether they use SIP or CPS or SIP or CPS linked to the earnings data, or PSID, or the top green one is actually the LEHD data, the administrative data that's going to be in the global database. So they're all very similar, and I think that's important. I also think you can do this internationally, so you compare it to the German SOP or the UK HLS, and I know that there are papers out there that do this, and they find that in UK, they find volatility falling, or in Germany, it's maybe going up a bit. So this would be very interesting to do the same figure for all the different countries. So that's basically what I'm pushing Luigi's to do, is to push the intersection of the administrative data to the survey data to find out more what does the administrative data have to add over the survey data, besides sample size and timeliness and all those types of things. Are the trends going to be different for a number of different things? So that could be another journal. That could be another journal issue of doing all these comparisons. It'd be great to have the same thing for all the countries. Okay, so turning to Peter's paper on wealth, race, and consumption smoothing, I think the key issue here is the wealth gap for Black households. And there's two important things about this. One is the gap at each decile. So you can see on the right, this is the median net worth for Blacks and whites, and you can see whites outperform Blacks at every point of the distribution. Now at the bottom, they're pretty similar because it's almost zero. The other thing you need to know, however, is where Blacks and whites are distributed across the distribution. So on the right, this is something from the SCF that shows that non-Hispanic whites are more likely to be at the top quintile, whereas non-Hispanic Blacks are way more likely to be at the bottom quintile. So there's two things going on, and these two things together is why they get different results, whether they control for assets or don't control for assets, right? If you just look at assets, then yeah, you're gonna have a big difference between whites. If you're gonna look at just the whites and Blacks, they're gonna be highly correlated to the distribution of assets, and where they are matters. So let's look at their estimates. So this is the estimate that Peter showed. It showed their black bars that shows the really tight error bounds, and three different sets of estimates. I want to add 4 different sets of estimates here to talk about. So the red dots are Patterson's, which also shows a similar drop in the MPC. So the MPC for the higher wealth are lower. And then the original Johnson, Parker, Solelis, which is similar to the Parker et al., also found a drop in assets. And this is an issue that I have to work out with Jonathan and Nick. Why these things different across. I think it's mostly the error bounds that cause some of these differences. But anyway, they also found a drop. So MPC is lower, right, for the higher assets. And then on the right, Scott Baker did one with some other data that shows a fall over the quintiles. And I have another paper that looked at the PSID that also shows a fall. Now, the key thing here is a lot of these show 0 for the MPC for the top wealth, right? So these guys are the ones who can really smooth. But other things show the levels are really different. So I think what I would like to see done is to reconcile some of these differences. They're all showing the change. They're all showing differences for the high wealth and the low wealth, but the levels of the MPCs are a very wide gap. So Patterson, the average MPC is almost 0.5, right? And Baker is 0.3, but this paper is getting a 0.23. The other thing is, this is the perfect data to evaluate how MPC changes the period analysis. I've thought about this. I'm not so sure how it should go. Normal circumstances, you say, oh, the transitory is nothing. MPC is nothing. As you add permanent, it could go up. But that's not what happens in the data. So they're using monthly, but many of these other data sets are using quarterly data. So Patterson, JPS, and Baker use quarterly data. Fisher et al. Use biannual data because it's a PSID. And Patterson, sorry, uses annual data. So it'd be great to do the MPC for monthly, for quarterly, and annual changes to see how that's going to change over time. And that, I think the JP Morgan Chase data would be perfect for that. So here's what the elasticities look like. So you can see that the white elasticities are slope of 0.09 and non-Hispanic blacks is 0.17. So obviously the MPC is higher for blacks than for whites. But if you look on the lower set, you can see high assets pretty much match the MPC for whites and low assets match for blacks. So once you control for this, a lot of it goes away. One of the interesting things, however, they looked at and they mentioned, I think they should push on this, is that high asset households of shocks, the positive shocks seem to increase consumption, but negative shocks don't seem to decrease consumption. Now this has been found, we found a similar result in our paper, and Baugh et al. Found a similar result looking at the tax refunds, but it'd be great to understand what's really going on here with the positive shocks or the negative shocks to see how they can tease that out. So then we get to all the racial gaps in consumption smoothing are explained by controlling for difference in liquid assets. So this is the chart that Peter showed, and you can see those last yellow bars, they're almost 0. But the interesting thing is that the orange bars are the ones that are from the data, and they impute the liquid assets using the survey consumer finances and the checking account balances. And when you look at the regression, they show that the whites get almost twice as much from a checking account balance than the blacks do. So just by that imputation, you're going to give more of an impact to whites than blacks. And I get concerned about how that's interacting with this result, right? So whereas the orange is the actual data, the yellow is imputed using the survey consumer finances. So the other thing that they mentioned is, I think that really needs to be done, is understanding the different components of liquid assets. So they have checking in the JP Morgan Chase data, but they don't have other things. What is it about these other things that they can evaluate? And I think that the survey consumer finances, the PSID, that has all these other ones would be a good way to help answer that question and turn it back to JP. Then there's the income and spending changes. So again, this is something I worry about when you look at the monthly transaction data. If you have 5 weekends in a month, you're going to have more spending. If you have 3 paydays in a month, you're going to have more income. So the key is how to come up with a month and how to come up with a household. So again, 1/3 of the households have joint accounts, have an account with JP Morgan and another account. How does that interact when you look at the household spending? How much, I know we have three credit credit card accounts in our household, and one credit card is only used for hotels and travel, and one credit card is used for furniture. So depending on what those are, it could have a big impact of what it looks like. So the final thing is some questions to JP Morgan, if it's possible, right? It'd be great if they can link to the voting data. Could they link to other data, like inside the Census Bureau, the ACS or the SIP, or the consumer expenditures, or I'd love to link it to the PSID. I think they have the perfect data set to examine the joint distribution of income, consumption, and wealth, where it's found that inequality goes up more. So the share of households in the top 5% of all three has gone up even more than other things. And I think this led to what Chief Mian talked about on the opening session, is the savings led of the rich, relating the wealth to the consumption spending, I think is what's helping them identify that in that paper. And then finally, I think, again, we should evaluate mobility. Maybe you could do, JP Morgan do maybe volatility 3.0, where they look at the mobility over time now that they have 6 years of data for some of these households. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, David, for those thoughtful comments. So our second set of papers here is going to be Monica Garcia Perez and Daniel Reck. First, I'm going to turn it over to Monica Garcia Perez for the mark of incarceration, wealth accumulation, and credit scores under the shadow of incarceration history and race. Monica is professor of economics at the School of Public Affairs at St. Cloud State University.
Okay, so let me share. I think I just happened right at the moment. I'm gonna take it.
No sweat.
Yes, sorry. So good transition between administrative data and non-administrative data. This project fits well in the trying to explore topics that are a little bit more sensitive, such as credit score and incarceration history. This work is done with co-authors Sarah Gator and Sandy Darity from Duke University. So the major goal of this project was to analyze the association between FICO's credit score and wealth accumulation across races and the household incarceration history. And it's going to be, I think the paper, we didn't do a good job in separating that some measures are individual level, but some measures are at the household level. So the FICO score and the race is identified at individual level, but wealth and incarceration measures are identified at the household level. And just to go through the main results, because we really have a few minutes in the presentation, we find that low FICO scores are connected to individuals individuals in household with incarceration history. So Blacks with household incarceration history, that means that at least someone in the family has been incarcerated, ever been incarcerated, have FICO scores more than, less, I put more, but less than 200 points than white without any incarceration history in the family. And then we also find the FICO scores segmented by groups, where the 12 groups are concentrated among white individuals without incarceration history in the family, and the bottom of the small distribution are Black without any of the with member of the family with incarceration history. So let's remember that incarceration history is incarceration history in their family, not necessarily incarceration history of the individual. Blacks without incarceration history have low representation at the top. So this is Black without any family member and themselves without incarceration history. While white with incarceration history have no representation at the bottom. So they kind of stayed in the middle of the two other extreme groups. If assets are present, then tangible assets, especially car ownership, are the most common assets among individuals with low FICO score. But of course, we're gonna have issues, and the survey it's facing the typical issues of surveys that manage data that is so sensitive. So it has almost self-reported. We managed to ask the actual FICO score and have a picture of the search copy of the information of the FICO score. Is not reported, completely self-reported. But it has the issue of trust of offering this kind of information just to a random call. So the data, this project kind of it does connect with the longer project of the national asset scorecards of community of color surveys that we've done in Miami, Tulsa, DC, LA, Boston, and Baltimore. This project is kind of second of interviews that were carried over 2017 in Baltimore. In this second level, the people that answered to the phase in Baltimore project were contacted via mail, email, or phone. Phone was the last way that people approached. And then out of the 154 respondents from the first phase, 51 responded to this second phase. And we separated the individuals between the different incarceration history or no incarceration history and race. So never incarceration history, his household white. And then we repeated Black and ever incarcerated. But you can see right away one of the major issues in terms of sample size. But in terms of the process, there are a lot of things that are going to be very important as a learning exercise, and also even as a point of stylized facts in the future. There are issues in the level of trusting indirect financial information to random requesters. That's an obvious one, but there's also the racial disparity in history, ability, and unscored records. So if we asking a population that is already very disconnected from the financial market, we are going to also be like find a larger proportion of individuals who are not even are not visible in this financial market. They don't know a score. They don't have a credit score. So I was not going forward with the slide. I'm sorry. So I'm just going to show you the questions, how the question was. What is the number of your last FICO score, credit score in the last 12 months? And we asked for the actual copy of verification of the credit score because we knew how this was going to be a sensitive part of the survey. But Baltimore was also interesting and important to look into the history of incarceration because also Baltimore has the highest rate of prison population, especially among African Americans. And that trend, even though it has gone down, it's still higher compared to the national averages. So it's a good place, if we want to use the word good, for kind of population that may have been impacted by incarceration and the family member. Because of course, as we go to different racial groups too, we may find out that some groups are more likely to have the history of incarceration versus others. There is a lot of literature, obviously, on credit scores, and then there's a lot of story on literature on prison and incarceration impact. But given that the two information are very sensitive, there is not a lot done on the connection to, and for obvious reasons. So I think this is a project that was like is breaking some barriers in terms of what information we guarantee, even for administrative data or for any other survey data already existed. It needed to be produced creative of first level. But in the idea of credit score and how credit score are used as impersonal measures, what part of the goal is to show that there is something structural also embedded in the FICO score. For ones that not everybody is a score, some individuals are credited invisible, And there is a disparity in that visibility. There is also creditworthiness misprediction. Blacks are more likely to underreport creditworthiness and lower credit knowledge in self-reported and reporting information. So 70% never even heard about where to find the FICO score or the credit history, even if they have a credit history. So going into the project numbers and findings, this is just looking at the average and median of the FICO score of the response and then separated by the groups. And we find that on average, individuals without incarceration history are likely to have higher FICO score. And then the people without incarceration history, lower FICO score, with the order being in the way the columns are presented here. But there are different things we find, and I'm going to say that at the end. We find that no incarceration Black individuals are almost as comparable as incarceration white individuals, at least within the respondents. And this was like a secondary finding that was not in the making. Was trying to see how this group separately look in terms of holding assets. Is in this project we find that individuals without incarceration is more likely to have liquid assets and other assets, especially other financial assets. But even having more liquid assets and other financial assets, they're the groups that are very all the time separated from the rest in terms of FICO score are the no incarceration history white, because the no incarceration history tend to almost comparable as the incarceration history white. And the group that always get to the bottom is Blacks with incarceration history in their family. Regardless of the level of holding assets, whether liquids, other assets, and retirements and other type of assets, I'm just showing here some of the assets to show that that is seen. So the FICO score don't match the whole process in which individuals without incarceration history in the family almost hold the same level of assets, especially liquids, checking, savings account. But the FICO score do not change. But the FICO score is very different between these two groups, between whites and Blacks without incarceration history. And this is just a way to see the concentration on the bottom and the concentration on the top. The bottom concentrate all the incarceration history Blacks, and the top incorporates most of the no incarceration history white, and in the middle then the whites and Black with and without incarceration history. So the incarceration history seems to, speculating completely, because in this case we're not doing the opposite, but incarceration history seem to be more relevant among Blacks, and then Blacks themselves, regardless of the history, are having lower FICO scores. Obvious limitations in our work is a sample size due to sensitivity of the indicators, incarceration history, and FICO scores. You just have to remember that incarceration history was asked and recorded in the first phase of the process. And 2 years later, FICO score was separate round. And then it's a subsample of the original group. And for that, then we try to account in a basic way, we try to account for the likelihood of individuals were asked in the first phase, they were asked about the capacity to manage financial accounts, their trust to financial institutions. So we use that information to account for the probability of who will answer the second round of the second phase of the survey, because we knew that those kind of indicators are going to affect the trust on revealing this information of FICO, so sensitive information such as FICO scores. And then more than revealing, then to also being able to have that information out of the 51 respondents, 2 respondents did not have FICO scores. They were not rated. This is a hard to find population, especially white incarceration households in the sample in Baltimore. And then we did not address the issue on a score population. That means individuals, there was a very small sample of individuals, and it's a small sample of a small sample. And then the potential bias for any survey data, which is a response on the more self-reported information of ever incarceration, the question on whether any family in their house has a history of incarceration. So thank you very much. I hope I didn't sign up with my internet. It's also having some issues.
No, you're good. Thanks, Monica. That's interesting. And thanks to Monica and Peter and anyone else who is presenting and also providing childcare. It's really challenging times, but you're all doing great work. All right, we're going to head to Daniel Reck next. So he'll be presenting tax evasion at the top of the income distribution. Theory and Evidence. He is Assistant Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. And since this is our last presentation, I'll just remind everyone again, if you have questions on any of the presentations, please do submit those in the boxes provided around the video. Okay, go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you, Austin, and thanks to the organizers for having us. This is joint work with John Guyton and Pat Langeteague at IRS, along with Max Frisch and Gabriel Zuckman. The paper is about the distribution and composition of tax evasion in the United States. So we want to know how much tax evasion there is at different parts of the distribution and what types of tax evasion are there at different points in the income distribution. This question would be important for the study of inequality for some different estimates about how we allocate income that's not on tax returns, as well as for tax enforcement policy. To date, the main way that people study tax evasion, the overall extent of tax evasion, is through a tool called the random audit. In the US, that refers to the National Research Program, that's what they're called. So you just audit a stratified random sample of tax returns and just see how much evasion you can find by doing that. And the main challenge with using random audits to study tax evasion at the top is that audits may not always detect all tax evasion. And that especially we expect to be a problem at the top of the distribution, because that's where the finances can be very, very complex, take a lot of resources to examine, and the ownership structures of pass-through businesses can be very complicated. And that sort of poses a measurement problem. So what we will do in this paper is we'll start from NRP random audits and then see what we can learn additionally on this question from some other data, which includes operational audits conducted by the IRS and focused offshore enforcement. So there's a large crackdown on offshore enforcement that we can see sort of who was doing this tax evasion that was shut down. What we find overall is that in the NRP data for random audits, if you take that data at face value, it suggests there's really very little evasion at the very top of the income distribution. While at the same time, the other data that we have suggests that evasion is relatively widespread at the top. So I'll use conservative methods to make that basic point, and then we'll have to consider like what type of correction to the random audit data, could one justify with these, by accounting for things that we see in other data, and that is a more ambitious exercise that requires stronger assumptions. Now, in the paper, there is a theoretical model that reconciles this kind of apparently contradictory set of facts between different data sets with a model of endogenous concealment of evasion. So, high-income people adopting concealment strategies to hide evasion even from random auditors. So it's more difficult to find, and therefore we measure less of it. So we'll start with the NRP data. I will show you data that pools the most recent waves of the NRP from 2006 to 2013. We'll rank people by our best measure of their true income, which is what the NRP auditor, after completing the exam, believes their true income to be. And then a conditional on that measure of true income, will estimate the income under reporting gap, which is the total amount of income under reporting as a fraction of true income. And in the paper, there's more data on the tax gap, which is total evaded tax over true tax. Broadly speaking, the story that is told by the tax gap numbers is similar. Now, what we're not going to do today is to look at corrections for undetected evasion. This is something that the IRS uses because it's aware that auditors may not find everything. There's significantly more discussion of that in the paper, and that also relates to sort of how what we're doing is different from some prior estimates. So the first graph I'll show you is just that income under reporting gap by rank in the income distribution, taking the random audit data at face value. And you can see there's a declining profile. At the bottom, the NRP random auditors are finding an underreporting rate of about 5 or 6%, and that falls to less than 1% within the top 0.01%. Now, I've split out the top 1% here into pretty fine bins so that you can see there really is a very sharp drop off within the top 1% as you move to the very, very top of the income distribution. What is there? What are NRP auditors finding? The most common form of evasion detected by NRP auditors is self-employment income or Schedule C income, because it goes on Schedule C of the Form 1040 tax return. So that accounts for the bulk of what is being found, and for a lot of the decline in the evasion rate as we move to the very top of the income distribution. Other forms of income, most notably partnership and S-corp income, so those are forms of pass-through income that are very common at the top. The auditors are finding very, very little. So what we do next is we take some data that we have from some prior work of mine and some other co-authors on offshore enforcement. We use that work to create some lists of people that we believe are quite likely to have been non-compliant using offshore wealth. So they had offshore accounts that they weren't reporting, and they weren't paying taxes on the income from that account. We have this data because there was a monumental crackdown on offshore wealth sort of within the period that we're studying. And it turns out that some of these people on these lists were subject to NRP random audits. So for those people that we sort of are fortunate enough to be able to observe in the random audit and in these offshore data, we can just see whether the NRP auditor found the offshore wealth. And the takeaway from this graph is that they do not find the offshore wealth almost all of the time. So that the red portion of the bar corresponds to when the NRP auditor indicated that they didn't find any non-compliance with respect to offshore wealth. And even within the blue bar, usually what's going on there is that the NRP auditor says, yes, this person had an offshore account, and they disclosed everything correctly, which we don't believe was actually the case. So who is in these lists of offshore people who've been evading offshore? Well, it's mostly people at the very top of the income distribution. And in fact, the probability of appearing in this list is sharply increasing even within the top 1% of the distribution. Using both of the two lists, which I'm afraid I don't have enough time to go into how we construct these, using both of the two lists, we're able to find almost 7% of the top 0.01% of the income distribution. That's 1,000 tax units in a group that only comprises some 14,000 tax units. So this is really different from the picture from the NRP, right? In the NRP, there was this sharp drop off in evasion, and we're seeing the exact opposite from this data. Moreover, the wealth itself that is reported or disclosed by these individuals is extremely concentrated at the very top of the income distribution. So this graph just shows you, the wealth shares for wealth that we observe being disclosed by individuals in our data versus wealth shares for non-hidden wealth. So non-hidden wealth is also very concentrated at the top. But offshore wealth is, remarkably like even more concentrated. This is something that is, a phenomenon that is happening for the very wealthiest and highest income households in the country. So this is, 25% of that wealth belongs to people at the top 0.01% of the income distribution, another 30%, roughly speaking, to people in the top 0.1%. So what we do is we make a number of assumptions. So what I've just shown you was very descriptive and suggests, yeah, there's something big going on here that the NRP audits are missing. We next make some strong assumptions about how much income that wealth would generate and the overall amount of income under reporting that these data would suggest is going on and would be missing from the random audit estimates, to just see like how much of a correction are we talking about here. This is a very highly uncertain exercise, and there are some sensitivity checks in the paper, but under what we find to be plausible assumptions, you can essentially undo all of that sharp drop off within the top 1% of the income distribution by accounting for offshore evasion that wasn't found in NRP data alone.
You have about 2 minutes, Daniel.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so I'll just show you a few more facts since I'm nearly out of time. First, from operational audit data, we find that operational auditors find more tax evasion at the top than the NRP suggests should exist for the full population, even though we're only accounting for the evasion of the 10% of returns that are subject to an operational audit in that tabulation. And finally, we look at partnerships and pass-through entities. Because NRP auditors essentially assess the entirety of an individual tax return, we know that high-income people get a lot of their income from these pass-through businesses that are filing their own tax returns. And NRP auditors, when they find someone with a lot of pass-through income, they basically usually are not examining that pass-through income. And as a result, we have that very low evasion rate for the pass-through income that I mentioned earlier, compared to 27% for other types of businesses, or 18% for C corporations, for very large corporations. So this suggests that the NRP is likely missing quite a lot of evasion via pass-through entities, which should be classified as individual tax evasion from an accounting perspective. And that income itself is highly concentrated, the income that's not being covered by the NRP. And so when we do something similar to what we've done for offshore evasion for partnership income and S Corp incomes, these are forms of pass-through income, again, highly uncertain exercise, we again see that a lot of that drop-off in the rate of evasion could be undone by accounting for pass-through income. And of course, there's probably both of these things going on, evasion via pass-through businesses and offshore income. So those would kind of compound one another if we were to build towards something like a final set of estimates of how much tax evasion there is at the top of the distribution. So what do we learn? If you look at random audit data naively, you would think that there's not very much evasion at the top, but a lot of other data suggests that in fact, there is substantial evasion at the top of the income distribution. There's a theoretical section in the paper that I wish I had more time to tell you about, that kind of talks you through why we might actually expect that to be the case for some fundamental reasons. The audit rate at the top is just one tool of the many policy tools that one could use to account for this. So I've listed some more on the slide there. Now we're working towards the one thing that I haven't put here because we don't have it yet, is some preferred estimates of just how much evasion there is at the top, given everything that we know. That's going to be a difficult thing to know for sure. But the point I want you to take away from this talk is that there's a reason that this is really, really hard to do, which is that high-income people are using more sophisticated evasion strategies that are difficult to get empirical traction on. Nevertheless, if you need an answer today in percentage terms, it seems quite likely that the tax gap is flat or increasing at the top of the income distribution, and that drop off in the NRP estimates is likely to be entirely undone by accounting for forms of evasion that aren't detected by NRP. All right, thanks very much. That's what I have.
All right, thanks so much, Daniel. Really interesting. We're running just a tiny bit behind schedule, but I think we're going to have plenty of time. So another reminder to put in questions. We have one more set of slides. So Juliana Londoño Velez is going to be the discussant for these two papers. She is assistant professor of economics at UCLA, and I will turn it over to you.
So thank you so much for having me. I think you should be seeing my slides now, hopefully. Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me and having me discuss these two fantastic papers. So let me just jump right in and discuss Monica's paper about incarceration, wealth accumulation, and credit scores. So just to briefly summarize in the 5 minutes I have to discuss this paper. So what does this paper do? It takes survey data and ask questions about FICO scores. The ultimate data set that they'll use that has information on FICO scores, wealth or asset ownership, and incarceration is a small sample, as she mentioned, of 46 individuals. That includes both whites and African Americans, with maybe some experience with the criminal justice system. And this is taken from a baseline survey of around 254 individuals that are in Baltimore that have, this survey took place 2 years ago, that were recruited by mail, phone, and Facebook, as she mentioned, and who have a history of conviction, or who anyone in the household has spent more than 30 days in jail, prison, or a youth correctional facility. That was called phase 1. So basically, to summarize, there are two stylized facts from this survey that they collect. One is that having a personal incarceration history is going to be associated with lower FICO scores and lower wealth accumulation. Just a descriptive fact. They don't interpret anything as causal. I want to discuss this later on. And then they also see that individuals who are Black and who've never been incarcerated, so there were around 8 of them in their sample. Even though they have more assets and they have less debt, they have the average FICO credit scores that are roughly similar to those to whites who have ever experienced incarceration. So that's around 7%. So of course, what we can say, is going to be limited by the sample size. We're comparing 8 individuals against 7 individuals, but that's roughly their main finding. So I wanted to have the next couple minutes that I have left to discuss some of these results. So the link between incarceration, wealth accumulation, and FICO scores is really interesting. And so you can imagine a situation where, just discussing the causality here, if you can imagine that if an individual is randomly assigned to incarceration and say a long spell of incarceration, then obviously that individual isn't earning any money. That individual will have a lower capacity to, build and, have assets, will have a low wealth accumulation. And because of that, their FICO scores will be affected. You could also imagine a different situation, which is the opposite, in which if some individual randomly got assigned low FICO scores, that will affect the type of debt that individual incurs. So the amount that the type of investments they can make. So that'll affect the wealth accumulation. And if you are in poverty, you're more likely to get in, be incarcerated, being in a poor neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera. And so that can affect your incarceration level as well. So here, thinking about what is the causality that's affecting the link between incarceration, wealth accumulation, and FICO scores will be very interesting. And I think it is worth discussing in the paper. The second is that there is an unobservable here. So what is it that's correlated with incarceration, low wealth accumulation, and FICO scores? It could be general poverty. So if if African Americans are more likely to live in poverty, then that's also going to be affecting both their level of accumulation, almost by definition, but also their FICO scores and their likelihood of interacting with the criminal justice system. It could be something about the quality of the neighborhoods. If they're living in bad quality neighborhoods where crime rates are very high, then they're more likely to be have interactions with the criminal justice system, and thus the whole cycle begins. It also could be that because of differences in the way that the credit, that the banks treat them, they could have different FICO scores, which affect the type of debt that they're in. And so if they are affected by the different, if they don't have access to different types of debt, then that's going to affect all the, the wealth accumulation. So just thinking about what can be something that affects all these 3 things, and how should we think about this, I think is going to be very important in the paper. Monica, you've put in the discussion, it's always the likelihood of anyone in your household being ever incarcerated. But even you can think that there can be differences conditional on being incarcerated in the incarceration lengths. So for instance, so this would be incarceration on the intensive margin. And I think this is relevant in discussing the causal effect that incarceration can have on wealth accumulation. It's very different if you're incarcerated very briefly, whereas if you are incarcerated for many years. And so that's going to affect, of course, your likelihood of, the amount that's going to affect the income that you're able to receive, or if you're incapacitated from working, et cetera, et cetera. And it could, there could be even racial gaps conditional on being incarcerated, just in incarceration length. So differences in criminal history, if there are racial differences in criminal history, that will affect the likelihood that someone, the length of incarceration, the type of crime. So different types of crimes will be treated differently in the criminal justice system. That's going to affect the sentencing length, or if there's discrimination by judges, for instance. And I think that could warrant a nice discussion. I wanted to just mention two recent papers. One of them from an Equitable Growth grantee, which is Carlos Arenancio Leon and his co-author Aneja. So what they do is that they actually use quasi-experimental variation to show that incarceration causes a reduction in access to credit, mostly because people who are randomly assigned to incarceration or quasi-randomly assigned to incarceration are incapacitated in paying off their debt. And so this in turn, it raises recidivism. And so just kind of thinking about these causal questions, I think it's interesting to go back to some of the research that has been debated here at the Center for Equitable Growth. Well, here, I mean, in this vacuum of Zoom. And then a recent paper came out as an NBER working paper, also compares African-American versus white entrepreneurs and their interactions with the credit market. And so what they find is that Black-owned startups start smaller, and that not only start smaller, but they remain smaller over the entire first 8 years. And so they find also that disparities in this credit worth, they find disparities in the credit worthiness, which is something that you also find. But something that they also find, and I think you don't discuss in your paper, is that entrepreneurs' perception, there's racial differences by their entrepreneurs' perceptions, how they are going to be treated by banks, and that differences in their perception hold them back. So Black entrepreneurs will actually apply for loans less often because they expect to be denied credit. And what they say is that this happens even when they actually have a good credit score, and in settings where, local banks will favor new business. And so interpreting these results, I think, will be interesting in the light of your findings. So I have
4 minutes, so yeah.
Okay, let me jump then to the second paper that we saw. Here, what Daniel and co-authors use is they use NRP random audits, IRS operational audits, and they complement this information about audits with the self-selected sample of OBD participants and FBAR filers. To basically summarize their findings is that they first document and quantify the limits of the random audits done by the IRS. They say that they can't detect sophisticated evasion strategies. Mostly, they don't detect the foreign accounts and pass-through entities, or S-corps and partnerships, which tend to be concentrated at the very top of the income distribution. And so by doing that, they underestimate the widespread evasion. They compare these random audits with what the IRS operational audits find, which are not random. They're going to be, selected in the people who are most likely to be evading. And so they find that actually those kind of audits do find more evasion than the random audits. And then they build a model to kind of understand the results that they find. They think about this concealment action, whether you can either take or not take the concealment action A, which reduces the likelihood of being caught cheating at a fixed cost. And so that's kind of helps reconcile the results of why these concealment actions are going to be very likely to be concentrated at the very top of the income distribution. Okay, so let me just give you some specific comments. So first, the way that it was portrayed in the paper is thinking about foreign accounts and pass-through entities are being kind of very different mutually excluding concealment strategies. But actually in a different paper, you actually show that partnerships, when you start looking at the data from FATCA, that partnerships actually hold the plurality of offshore assets and income and tax havens, especially at the very top of this distribution. So this complementing, like these concealment strategies are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They kind of complement each other, and kind of looking into that, I think is very interesting. You also show that misreporting income increases with the complexity of the pass-through structure. And so it would be interesting to know, what is the likelihood by income bin of being associated with a sole proprietorship versus a tiered partnership structure, or the number of tiers? And so whether there's you can see a gradient there. You could do this separately by people who have or don't have a foreign account. In your estimates of the tax gap, you have to make assumptions on the rate of return of offshore wealth. And I wonder why you have to do that, given that in previous paper, I mean, you have large research agenda. So it's kind of, so in a previous paper with some co-authors, you have information on both wealth and income. And so I was wondering if you can just leverage that to inform what is the rate of return on offshore wealth in this particular paper, use that in this paper. And then I think you have a really interesting setting to look at policy counterfactuals, because you have very good information about how audits works, how different type of audit strategy works. And so I was wondering if you could say something about, with the fixed budget constraint, the IRS, what does an optimal audit strategy for high income taxpayers look like? So what kind of audits would, maximize the bang for your buck? Or what enforcement strategies would maximize the net return, so the recovered tax revenue net of the resource cost of enforcement? I think this is one aspect that I think was missing in the paper, and I think would be very interesting, which is, what is the resource cost of enforcement, and how does it vary across the different strategies that you looked at? So it would be important to compare the resource cost of the NRP random audits versus the IRS operational audits versus other sophisticated audits of closely held businesses that you mentioned in the paper, and the IRS Global High Wealth Program that you mentioned. And just talking a little bit about it, how should we be thinking about this? So for instance, you can think, how much has to be spent to get an additional dollar on these efforts? I think that would be very interesting to kind of say something about the optimal policy. The last slide I have here is that we know that evasion is endogenous both to the tax incentives, but also to the enforcement environment. And Owen Sadar and Eric Zwick here at the Center for Equitable Growth, there was this event that happened earlier this year. There was Vision 2020, Evidence for a Stronger Economy. They talk about the importance of thinking about reforming the tax treatment of pass-through income because of the incentives that it creates for individuals to use those pass-through entities to evade taxes. And so I wonder if you just as a broad general discussion, if you try and shut down the evasion mechanisms or the loopholes that are just provided by the tax code, how does that affect evasion? And that would have implications on your estimates of evasion through these loopholes, right? The other thing is that this paper, unlike the more recent work in progress that you're working on, like a fourth paper of yours, estimates evasion via foreign accounts that precede the very recent US enforcement efforts, not only the voluntary disclosure, but FATCA more generally, which is going to affect the likelihood of being caught cheating. And so I was wondering, just from a policy perspective, I think it is important to know how the recent enforcement efforts, the US has invested a lot in trying to improve enforcement. How do you think that they're going to shape the prevalence, the nature, and the distribution of evasion, given that your estimates are all precede these all enforcement efforts? Maybe this is something for another paper. Maybe this is something that you're thinking about already. But I think it is important, because when you're reading your paper, it's always the question is, well, there's a lot of things happening in the next couple of years. I wonder how this was affected afterwards, especially and the likelihood that the IRS can detect foreign accounts in particular. And so it would be interesting to know how these recent initiatives have affected both the likelihood of being caught cheating and maybe changes in the type of concealment actions taken by taxpayers. And so maybe you can say something about the limitations of these kind of initiatives, but maybe that would be a little bit too much. Okay. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Juliana. Those were great comments. So we're going to try to give a little bit of time for response to comments. We don't have a ton of time left because I have been not a strict timekeeper. But we're going to go to Peter first. And before you start, Peter, I'll go ahead and, for the sake of time, pose a question that the audience asked. Do you have any evidence of how income volatility affects the marginal propensity to save? Do you expect, is it, or do you expect it to be similar to the effect on consumption? So you can try to wrap that up. Peter will have an assistant for this response.
Hi, can everyone hear me? So I think it's appropriate for a WCEG conference, given the other WCEG research on work-life balance, that my son decided to wake up from his nap. He napped very well during the presentation part of the session, but he chose to wake up from his nap early so that he could attend the Q&A session. So I have an assistant here, as you mentioned. So in terms of research substance, the answer to the question about, so the marginal propensity to save is 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So just mathematically. Having said that, it depends on the time horizon, and it also depends on the definition of spending. So we're looking at a fairly narrow definition of spending because we're specifically interested in consumption smoothing or failures of consumption smoothing. And so we haven't looked at the savings response directly. I think that's an interesting suggestion. I also want to thank David for a really excellent and detailed discussion with a lot of really helpful suggestions. I was going to react briefly to a subset of the points he made. So the first is David added some extra estimates to the MPC plot, which I really appreciated. But if you add the confidence intervals for those estimates you added, the plot becomes illegible. So we actually started, for example, with the JPS 2007 estimates, but the MPCs on the heterogeneity range from more than 0 to more than 1. And so the plot, that's why we went with the later estimates on, more generally, the intervals on all of those papers. If the papers report intervals, not all of them do. The intervals are huge, so that's why they weren't on that plot. You had a suggestion about investigating income asymmetry. So we think this is meaning, is there a different response to positive shocks than negative shocks? We think this is really interesting. There's a really great new paper by Jonathan Parker and co-authors, which I think is now forthcoming in the AER, about this asymmetry issue. And we haven't had a chance to look into it in detail. There's a question about, you told us that you had 3 credit cards. And so I have a good anecdote for you here, which is that I gave a talk once at UChicago booth where someone told me that they had 5 different bank accounts. The good news here is that economists are fairly atypical. And so if you're an economist and you're watching this presentation, you should not extrapolate too much from your own experience to the broader US population. So yes, people do have credit cards, we try to capture them, but in fact, more than half of US households tend to focus their spending on debit cards. And so basically by the way we construct the sample, we're gonna end up overemphasizing those debit card users. And so we're not gonna get it right get it complete for everyone. But from a research perspective, the good news is that, holding tons of credit cards is not what the typical US household, particularly in an hourly job, looks like. There were finally two things about broader data. So first, you suggested a report, Income Volatility 3.0, looking at estimates over time. This is, you suggested sort of to JP Morgan Chase Institute. And I magically logged on before nap time ended and wrote that report. And it's actually called Income Volatility 3.0. You guessed the title. And it shows the evolution of income volatility for the 6 years available in the data. So income volatility is about stable. It's not a report that I'm an author on, but I was sort of a, I guess, consultant or unpaid advisor on some of that project. So by this measure, income volatility has been stable from about 2012 forward. And then I guess if that was income volatility 3.0, you suggested income volatility 4.0, which is, well, if you can link to public voter record data, why not link to additional survey data or data at the census? So I think this is a fantastic idea. I'm not a paid employee of JP Morgan Chase, so this is very far above my pay grade, but I'm very much enthusiastic about this idea. Thanks so much.
Okay, great. Let's turn it over to Luigi if you have any responses to David.
So I want to thank David for a very good and useful discussion. So I'll try to maybe pick on a couple of points. So I agree with everything that David said. So I don't have a counter response. So I can say a couple of things. So it is definitely true. I would love to have this administrative data organized both at the individual level and at the household level. Unfortunately, when we think about international comparisons, a few countries have the ability to do that, like the Scandinavian countries, because they can link the tax records or the social security records with the family registries. And I know that there is a subset of people using the tax records that can actually also look at the composition of the household, etc. But there are a few countries where this is just not an option. For the sake of comparability across countries, the kind of minimum common denominator is to have individual level data. And then, of course, you have to pass on the great opportunities afforded in some cases by having household level data. So the papers that will come out of this project contain a common component that is the same across countries. So it gives the opportunity for people to look at statistics that are comparable, because the micro units is the individual, so it's the same across countries. But then each countries have a sort of part B where they can also expand the analysis to include households, and some of the countries, some of the country teams actually have done precisely that. So I think the Swedish team, for example, look at the importance of looking at individual data versus looking at household data, precisely for looking at mechanisms like risk sharing within the household instead of individual, the interaction between insurance provided by government programs versus within the family, and so forth. So there's plenty of themes that are really important. I have a similar kind of response to your point about how, what kind of characteristics, what kind of demographic characteristics do we have in the data. So clearly we do not have the richness of survey data. The survey data have, and I've used this data, of course, as you know, and I share with you a seat on the PSID board. So, I've been a long-time user and supporter of the PSID. So we don't have the richness of the demographic characteristics that we have in survey data. Again, there will be a huge difference between the countries that can, link data sources, like Scandinavian countries. You can know everything. In Iceland, you have access to DNA data now. That's something that probably not even survey data can match. So it will really be country specific. The US is actually pretty much is at the bottom of the list, because the LHED and etc. The amount of demographic information is really kind of small. We don't even have information on education, so we have to make needs with information on permanent income, industry, and so forth. The kind of general point that there is probably a project to be pursued about the differences between what we learn from survey data and what we learn from administrative data, when there are differences, is clearly top of many people's agenda, including mine, including yours. It was prompted in the US, at least, from this divergent results on volatility, and the project actually will show how the evolution of volatility has been, it's one of the set of common statistics that we want all countries to provide. So it's actually interesting that in some countries we see an increase in volatility, in others a decrease in volatility, mirroring what we see in administrative data. So the pattern, interestingly, is not the same across country, in the same way that the pattern of inequality is not the same across country. Like a country like Brazil and Argentina, if you at least looking at the formal sector, they actually show declining inequality rather than increasing inequalities, which is something interesting that I learned from editing and managing these different papers. So thanks a lot for the comments, and look forward to more conversation.
Thanks, Luigi. So we're a little short on time, and I know other people have other obligations, but if people are able to stay a couple more minutes, we'll try to wrap up here. So let's go over to Monica.
Well, just at 2 minutes, I'm going to try to say thank you, Juliana, for the comments, all well taken, and I agree with you a lot of different points, especially on the points on reverse causality and racial gaps and observables and the intense margin, which is a little bit harder because we don't necessarily have a variable that will account for that. One of the things that the project was, I mean, it was a less of the typical structural identification strategy approach that we take in economics. It was to really have some of that connection, not just between incarceration, wealth accumulation, and FICO scores, but incorporating the component of race. It's very interesting in any way we divided the sample. We kept seeing how incarceration history was definitely more of a component of low FICO score, low wealth accumulation among Blacks than among whites. And then even, so there is a theme within the paper that then connect, like there is all this reverse causality between those average components of incarceration, low wealth accumulation, and FICO, but there is other component around all that, and it's race. So that was part of the goal of the paper, because that became a major component of the results. And then thank you for the 2 papers that you recommended. Really haven't had the time to look into 2020 more than since March, I don't know. And then the last part, it's within those within the usage of credit, but for the African American, we do have a lot of indicators on the trust and self-confidence of credit worthiness, and which we were trying to explore that, especially trying to connect to the FICO score. We didn't have much luck on that, but there is a lot to say about the within groups variation between whites and Black in the confidence on the credit worthiness. Is true. So thank you so much for reading our papers, and I will email you for the details on the papers that you recommended. Thank you.
Great. If we have any other questions we didn't get to, I will email them to presenters. I'm going to let Daniel close us out, but before I do, I want to just encourage everyone to attend the 4 o'clock session with Representative Rokana, which should be really interesting. All right, Daniel, take it away.
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Juliana, for those comments. They were great. There's one thing I'll talk about substantively, and I won't take up too much time. So you mentioned that potential overlap between what we were accounting for offshore evasion and evasion through partnerships, because as you rightly point out, we now know that a lot of offshore wealth is owned by partnerships. But when we when we sort of add in offshore wealth, what we're mostly looking at is financial capital income that derived from offshore wealth, whereas most of the adjustments for partnerships are due to real business income, and there's only a small amount that we're, essentially by our assumptions, is coming through a financial capital income. So because of the way that we sort of make some assumptions to do this, there won't be very much overlap there, and you can more or less add them on top of each other. But that's partly just because we didn't add in anything to do with business income when we're adding in, when we're trying to account for offshore wealth, which is actually a limitation of a lot of studies on offshore wealth, is that they sort of only look at financial capital income that might be evaded, and rather than say the evaded business income that could generate the principal or something like that. So that overlap, I think, absolutely does exist, but we kind of get lucky in the way we measure it. Okay, now looking at complexity by income rank is a great idea. We should do that. It is harder to get the rate of return on offshore wealth from the FATCA data than I had hoped when we started doing that other paper you mentioned on FATCA. I'm not going to go into why, but it's a lot harder than we had hoped. And yeah, you said a number of things about like what the optimal policy implications are, the things about optimal audit policy. I think those are very, very interesting questions, and I'm keen on doing more on that type of thing. It gets sophisticated enough. I think you're right that there's going to be more papers that'll need to be written about this, and I'm excited about this stuff and keen to do some more of that work. Yeah. So thanks for that.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for staying a few extra minutes. Like I said, do check out that 4 o'clock session. And thanks so much to all of us.